In downtown Mobile, at the very foot of Government Street, is one of my favorite places, the Admiral Hotel. "150 years ago, this was the site of a grand house, and also Mobile's connection to an infamous murder trial, and perhaps the one thing that stopped Jack the Ripper." We're going to tell you what we know. Back to the channel. My name is Sina, and this is one of my favorite stories. I researched this years ago. Always wanted to do something with it. I love the story because of its connection to Mobile, Alabama, but also because it says a lot about the time period we're talking about. Now, here's the house that stood at 252 Government Street in Mobile, Alabama. Yes, that is a house. It is a private home. It later became the McGill Institute. It was the childhood home of Florence Elizabeth Chandler Maybrick, an American woman who was convicted of murdering her husband in England. Florence, known as Florrie, was the daughter of William George Chandler, who was a banker and a former mayor of Mobile, but he died 3 months before she was born during the Civil War. The papers in America later made a meal out of her family history, both pro and con. According to an 1892 article in the Pittsburgh Press, Florrie came about scandal naturally. She inherited it from her mother. According to this completely unsubstantiated report, in 1860, just about the beginning of the war, and before her husband had died, a captain, Frank DuBarry, appeared on the scene. He was a dashing young officer connected with the Ordnance Department of the Confederacy. He paid devoted attention to Mrs. Chandler, and she recklessly encouraged him. The improper conduct of the two became a favorite topic for low gossip. Suddenly, Mr. Chandler fell ill and died, and the circumstances were suspicious. Mrs. Chandler did not attend the funeral, nor were any charges levied against her, or even an official investigation. But, it says here, the doors of decent women were shut in her face. Mrs. Chandler then took her 2 children, Florrie and her brother, and removed them to Georgia, where several of her husband's relatives were living. In Georgia, they would have nothing to do with her. I don't know where they're getting all this stuff. Within a year, Mrs. Chandler married the brave but weak Frank DuBarry. He was no longer infatuated with her, according to this article, but conceived himself to be under some obligation to her. I'm sure that is why he followed her to Georgia. Then he and his family sailed either from Charleston or Savannah. The writer doesn't know, and we don't know who the writer is. They're not quoted in this article. And 2 days later, DuBarry died at sea. Again, circumstances directed suspicion very strongly toward the widow. Of course. The captain proposed to return to the port, but Mrs. DuBarry strenuously objected, insisting that the body should be cast overboard and that the vessel should hurry on to England, which was finally done. Like so many newspaper reports at the time, there are no sources at all to back any of this up, but it does give you a picture of her marriages, which there were 3. Finally, Florrie's mother, Carolyn Chandler DuBarry, married German officer Baron Adolf von Roque in 1872. Then the family spent most of their time overseas. Florrie was educated partly in Europe and partly in America, under the instruction of masters and governesses. According to Florrie, she was just too delicate for college life. She lived partly with her grandmother in New York and partly with her mother. She said of her early life, "My life was much the same as that of any other girl who enjoys the pleasures of youth with a happy heart." In 1880, Florrie and her mother decided to make a return trip to Mobile, Alabama. Apparently, not all doors were shut to them. They traveled to America on the SS Baltic. The Baltic was an Oceanic-class ocean liner that was built in 1871 for the White Star Line, like the Titanic. She was one of the first 4 ships ordered by White Star from shipbuilders Harlan and Wolff after Thomas Ishmael bought the company. You remember him. He's the one that got on the lifeboat. Florrie at this time was not yet 20. She was very beautiful. She had golden hair and blue eyes. They were almost violet eyes. On board the SS Baltic, she met James Maybrick, a British cotton broker 24 years older than her. The pair became attached immediately, spending long days at sea in each other's company and attending the dinners and receptions for first-class passengers together. A year later, on the 27th of July, 1881, the couple were married at St. James Church, Piccadilly in London. They eventually settled at Battlecrease House, a huge house in the suburbs of Liverpool. Looking back, perhaps Maybrick was hoping for more money out of his marriage. Anglo-British marriages were very, very trendy at the time, especially those linking Old English names to American girls' money. Just think of Lady Cora. Another thing to take into consideration, he was a cotton merchant. Now, a large portion of the profits from cotton transactions in Mobile went to Liverpool, so it would probably make sense to Florrie that she'd be going back and forth a little bit more than this. Cotton linked the two cities. According to the National Museum in Liverpool, cotton from Mobile was shipped to Liverpool in seasonal voyages, starting in October and ending in December. In the 1850s, there were about 700 voyages per year between the two ports. And because of this, Liverpool supported the Confederacy in the Civil War, going so far as to actually flying the Confederate flag over public buildings. Yikes. Now, there were a number of problems in their marriage. First of all, he had a few mistresses on the side, one of which gave him 5 illegitimate children. He didn't have as much money as she thought, and he was a hypochondriac, a bit of a pill popper. He loved patent medicines, and those things back then were filled with all sorts of poisons. And James Maybrick was known as an arsenic eater. That's what they called them, arsenic eaters. People in the 19th century consumed arsenic for a variety of reasons, and usually with tragic consequences. By today's standards, this seems bizarre. Despite being highly toxic, arsenic was used in medicines to treat a range of ailments from fevers, skin diseases, and especially syphilis. Arsenic was used in cosmetics, particularly those to lighten the complexion, which was very, very popular. That white skin was popular at the time. It was common practice to get fly papers, soak the arsenic out of them, and then apply them to the face for breakouts, which was something Florrie was doing. That'll be important later. I've always been fascinated with arsenic green. It's a dye that gets its color from arsenic. Invented in 1775, it was used in paints, wallpapers, fabrics, even candy coatings. It was such a vibrant color that it made beautiful dresses. I went down sort of a rabbit hole in researching this, and actually it wasn't that dangerous to wear an arsenic green dress because at the time, the undergarments were so voluminous that it wouldn't really touch the skin. The thing you'd have to worry about is if it got rained on, then it would soak through and it could be a nasty situation. And crazily enough, people ingested small doses of arsenic, believing it increased their strength and their stamina. That could be what Maybrick was doing as well. But he was known to eat the stuff. The Mabricks had 2 children, but were not really happy. To make things worse, Florrie was out of her element. She was a natural flirt, which has not been a problem in Alabama. When she did step out, she did it assertively. She had an affair with a local businessman named Alfred Brierly, and it was serious enough that she met him in a hotel in London. Of course, James found out about the affair, and things got really bad on the day of the Grand National Horse Race. It was a very big deal that year as they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the race. Everyone was there and saw her flirting. Here's Donovan. He won that day. Anyway, they got home, had a huge fight that the servants were even involved in. James gave her a black eye and vowed to divorce her. Getting back to the servants, Florrie had a couple of other things working against her in 1889. First of all, the nanny hated her. The nanny's name was Alice Yap, and she played a pivotal role in the story. I can't help but think of Angela Lansbury's gaslight servant, you know, how she can barely condescend to speak to her mistress and then helps with all the gaslighting. I love that performance, by the way. But she was like that. She was completely out of line. To make matters worse, James' brother Edwin was staying with them. Also not a fan of Florrie's. Now, when pouring through the newspaper articles about Florrie, I found this interesting one in the Atlantic Journal from 1904 when she was returning to America. Now, although it gave no sources for this information, I thought this part was interesting. Quote, James Maybrick was the eldest of 3 brothers, Edwin and Michael being younger. The second brother also fancied the young American and sought her hand, but this suit was rejected. It will be remembered that in the death of Mr. Maybrick, Edwin and Michael were the instigators in the persecution of his widow, and it's claimed among those in the position to know, hint, hint, that the sting of rejection which rankled Edwin's breast was the cause for his share in the actions taken. Of course, I'm not sure about this at all because the article also says that Brierly was just a friend. Yeah. Then on April 27, 1889, James took a double dose of strychnine. No indication of why. He fell ill and his doctors thought he had acute dyspepsia, but he kept getting worse. Florrie's reaction was very Victorian. She went to bed, but first she wrote a letter to Alfred, but it never reached him because Alice Yap, remember her? She was supposed to mail the letter and said she just gave it to Edwin. Great. James Maybrick died on May 11, 1889. His brothers ordered an autopsy which revealed faint traces of arsenic, but not a fatal dose, especially not for an out-of-control user like James. They couldn't prove that Florrie gave him the dose. He might have taken it himself. She did have some things that looked incriminating. First of all, she had bought the arsenic-laden flypaper around this time to lighten her complexion. But the situation to Florrie was unfair to begin with. Here's her own description of how this all went down. I opened my eyes in terror. Edwin Maybrick was bending over me as I lay upon my bed. He had my arms tightly gripped and was shaking me violently. "I want your keys. Do you hear? Where are your keys?" he exclaimed harshly. I tried to form a reply, but the words choked me, and once more I passed into unconsciousness. It is the dawn of the Sabbath, and I am still lying in my clothes, neglected and uncared for, without food since the morning of the day before. Consciousness came and went. During one of these interludes, Michael Maybrick entered. "Nurse," he said, "I'm going to London. Mrs. Maybrick is no longer the mistress of this house. As one of the executors, I forbid you to allow her to leave this room. I hold you responsible in my absence." Florrie was not allowed to see her children. She did not attend the funeral. She was kept under lock and key by servants that hated her until the police removed her. The trial captivated the public. It featured conflicting medical evidence and accusations of infidelity on both sides. Florence maintained her innocence, claiming she had administered white powder to her husband at his request, unaware it even contained arsenic. This is a great quote. Quote, "If you may, if a person is addicted to the habit of reading novels, you can tell after reading only 1 or 2 pages not only who is going to marry who, but also who is going to poison who." It sounds like the beginning of a novel itself, but Justice Stephen actually said this during the Maybrick murder trial. Florence was arrested and charged with her husband's murder. Her description. "My trial was set for the 31st of July in St. George's Hall, Liverpool. Immediately after 9 o'clock on that day, the part of the building which is open to the general public was filled by a well-dressed audience, including many of my one-time friends. During all the days of my trial, I am told Liverpool society fought for tickets. Ladies were attired as if for a matinee, and some brought their luncheons that they might retain their seats. Many of them carried opera glasses, which they did not hesitate to level at me." According to Florrie, there was no chance of her getting a fair trial in Liverpool. She said it was a mockery of justice to hold such a trial in such a place as Liverpool at such a time by a common jury, and it was a mockery of common sense to expect that any Liverpool common jury could, when they got to the jury box, dismiss from their minds all that they had heard and seen. The spectators hissed at Florrie like cats. In the end, there were a couple of things they could not forgive her for. She was an American, and as such, she demanded her rights. She didn't get them, she demanded them. And then she was an unfaithful woman. She admitted that. Brierly admitted that. She was guilty of immorality, but that shouldn't mean that she was therefore guilty of murder. Now that we are looking back at this at a distance of over 100 years, there seems to be something else that was in play, and that is the changing roles of women. The new woman was a figure that challenged traditional gender roles and societal expectations from women. This made her a threat for many reasons. First of all, the new woman was rejecting the traditional role of wife and mother, seeking education, careers, independence, even the vote. The new woman was often portrayed as more sexually liberated, exploring her own desires and seeking pleasure beyond the confines of marriage. This challenged Victorian ideals of female purity and passivity. The entry of women into the workforce and higher education threatened to disrupt the existing social and economic order, potentially leading to competition for jobs and resources. For many men, the rise of the new woman represented a loss of control over women's lives and a potential shift in the balance of power within families and society. Remember, it was only 4 years before that John Singer Sargent's portrait of Madame X caused a major scandal in Paris. The subject, Virginie Gautreau, is depicted in a dynamic, almost reclining pose, which was considered highly unconventional and even scandalous for a woman of high society. And the original version of the painting featured one of Gautreau's shoulder straps slightly slipped down, revealing skin. Scandalous. Her pale skin was also very pale, which critics thought was a sign of using arsenic. A lot of people did, as we said. But mainly it was her expression. She just didn't care. The scandal severely damaged Sargent's reputation in Paris and forced him to repaint the shoulder strap to appease the critics and Gautreau herself, because she was embarrassed. Despite the controversy, Portrait of Madame X is now considered a masterpiece of American Expressionism. Sargent was living in England, and like Florey, he was an American not quite fitting into British Victorian society. He liked strong, independent women. He painted a lot of women the British did not approve of. The trial was a travesty. Florence was held incommunicado, meaning she was isolated and couldn't talk to anyone about her case. British law back then also prevented her from defending herself or testifying on her own behalf. And to make matters worse, she couldn't even point out that her husband's will left her with a strong motive to keep him alive. She got nothing. The judge in the case, Sir James Stephen, was also a bit of a mess. He had had a paralyzing seizure shortly before, and some people at the trial thought him incompetent. He rambled on and on about her wickedness and her immorality. And the cherry on the sundae is there were no courts of appeal in England at the time, so Florence had no way to challenge her conviction. Even after new evidence came to light that her husband had been using arsenic recreationally, the Home Office refused to grant her a pardon. She ended up being sentenced to death by hanging. 4 days before the scheduled execution, the British Home Secretary and Prime Minister advised Queen Victoria to commute the sentence. Their argument was that although Mrs. Maybrick may have intended to poison her husband, there was no evidence that the poison caused his death. The Queen was still offended by Mrs. Maybrick's adultery, though. She would not let her go. She commuted the sentence to life imprisonment with hard labor. It wasn't until 1904, after 15 long years in prison, that King Edward VII finally pardoned Florence. But by then, her life was ruined. She wrote a book about her experience, My 15 Lost Years. Much of the book is an indictment of the British penal system, and it's well worth a read. She was especially bothered that nothing was being done to assist the mentally ill in prison. There were a lot of them. She had been sentenced to hard labor, and she worked in the prison kitchen, and quite often wealthy visitors were paraded through, which she found especially draining. She found the remarks tedious and hurtful because, she had just been one of them fairly recently. At one point, a benevolent-looking woman remarked that the prison was charming, saying it was so nice and homelike. Florey said she could only wonder what this lady's home was like. Meanwhile, the case inspired a 15-year campaign to vindicate Florey, spearheaded by the English and American feminists. Those who championed Mrs. Maybrick believed that her conviction was unwarranted by any evidence in the case, but was the result of prejudice against an adulterous woman. She had one affair. Brierley said in a statement that it wasn't that big of a deal, and remember, he had 5 illegitimate children. Finally, in 1905, Florence was released from prison on parole. She moved back to the United States and lived quietly until her death in 1941. But I told you there was a connection to Jack the Ripper, so here it goes. Back in 1992, the supposed diary of James Maybrick popped up, claiming he was Jack the Ripper. Kind of weird from the start. This guy, Michael Barrett, said his friend gave him the diary, but then later his wife claimed it was in her family forever. The diary had been written in a scrapbook that the first couple of pages had been ripped out of. Like someone found it at a yard sale, just ripped out the used pages and used the rest of it because it was the right time period. That's what I'm thinking. There isn't a lot of evidence that we can prove that Maybrick was actually in London at the time of the murders. He did stay in the area, so he was there often. And one of the things the diary claims is in one of the murder scenes, There is FM on the back of the wall, written in blood. It could have been FM written in blood, which the diarist says is FM Florrie Maybrick. We do know that James regularly traveled to London for business and was purported to have lodged close to the Whitechapel murder scenes, but there's no definite evidence that James Maybrick was in London during the time of each murder. There's more, though. There's more. In 1993, a pocket watch turned up, bearing engravings that read, J. Maybrick, I am Jack, and contained the initials of the canonical 5 victims, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Tests on the watch were not fully conclusive, but suggested that it was not a modern forgery. If it was, they did a really good job on it because it was worn over the engravings. That's what we know. What we don't know is if any of it's true. We don't know if she killed her husband, and we don't know that he was Jack the Ripper. But wouldn't it have been ironic if she did, and he was? Certainly makes for a better story. Florence Maybrick lived out her days alone with her cat in South Kent, Connecticut as Florence Chandler. I found a sad little obituary from the New York Times. She passed away in the 3-room single shack where at 80 she had been living as a recluse. Sometime during the last night, she had arisen from bed and walked about the tiny bedroom in the drab cottage. She managed to get back to the bedside and fell upon it. The body was found by a neighbor, Howard Cronkite, who for several years had been deputized by the other neighbors to visit her daily to see to her needs. The obituary goes on to say it had been rumored that Miss Chandler was really Miss Maybrick, the principal of that infamous trial, but not until today did even Mr. Cronkite hear confirmation of those rumors. In gathering her effects for the authorities, he found a scrapbook which Miss Chandler had never shown anyone, even the neighborhood children who she loved. It bore her true name and contained yellow clippings of her trial. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Catch you later.